light, super love, oh, oh, until the twilight, the bright skies, super love, oh, oh, up to the moon, we will go beyond all reason tonight.
All right, fantastic. All right, this ought to get our juices going for the one last lecture for today, hosted by the Metavisionary. My very good friend, Dr. Scott Madry, who is a professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His topic today, and the last one for our series today, will be satellite telecommunications. Take it away, Scott.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jim. I appreciate that. And hello again to everyone. It's great to be here again with you. I'm going to talk to you about the biggest and most important and largest commercial space application, which is satellite telecommunications. And I want to offer credit where credit is due to my very good long-term colleagues and friends, Dr. Joe Pelton and Dr. Dan Glover, who are experts in this field and who are have provided some of the content that I'll be sharing with you today. So what we're going to talk to you next is this whole world of satellite telecommunications. And so why do we care? Why do we want to talk about this? Well, the truth is satellite telecommunications is by far the largest commercial space market. It's where the jobs are, it's where the money is, it's where the commercial businesses, is where the new commercial activities are. And it's fundamental in tying together our modern world. The modern digital world that we live in is integrated with this amazing technique and technology of satellite telecommunications. So I'm going to talk to you some about telecom. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, very little about the technologies that goes into any telecom course you get in electrical engineering would go into great deal of detail in terms of frequency modulations and all of these things, but I'm not going to go into that level of detail here. I just want to give you a general overview of the origins, current status, and most importantly, the future directions of satellite telecommunications. So at the end of this lecture, I certainly hope you will be able to define what satellite telecommunications is, the general market size. You should know something about the two primary orbits that we utilize. You should be able to understand and describe a little bit about the historical context, practical uses that we have in satellite telecommunications, understand where the business is, where the money is. And as in all of these things, we have to pay attention to the dual use nature of all of these. And by dual use, I mean that all of these space technologies have both commercial, business, public benefit, but also national security and military applications and capabilities. And that complicates world in terms of the types and amounts of national and international cooperation and trade and technologies, and all of these things come together in ways that are integrated, and we can't really separate our commercial world from the realities of national security. So remember, I talked to you about little Iulius here, Iulius, this ancient Roman slave boy serving a nice tray of fresh ripe figs. Remember that satellites are servants of humanity. It's an appropriate name. All of these satellites are designed, they serve specific purposes and activities that help us as a society, help us as a humanity in meeting complex problems that we have facing us today and in the future. So here we have again a slightly old slide about 10 years ago, and this shows us the operational satellites by function on the right and the orbital planes on the left. And you can see that on the right, the three largest slices of pie here are commercial satellite telecommunications, government, and military. And this makes up nearly about 60%, was by far the largest area of satellite applications was the domain of telecommunications because it's so generically useful. You can see that things like space science are very small, single digits. Remote sensing were about 10%. Navigation, all of these were really quite small, but telecom was the monster. And you can see in terms of orbits, we have about half and half LEO and GEO, little bit in MEO. These are the navigation satellites that I'll talk about to you later in much more detail. But the GEO satellites were primarily telecommunication satellites, and this is the way the world was for quite a long time. Again, I talked to you briefly before about the satellite industry. Satellite telecommunications is a massive global industry. There are tens of thousands of very good paying jobs, engineering jobs, applications jobs in around the planet because these things are just so very useful to us. So you can see here 2015, the satellite services industry was by far the largest uh, portion of the entire satellite world commercially, 127 billion US dollars. And satellite services, of course, are internet services, direct broadcast television, voice over internet, people providing services by satellites. $100 billion of ground equipment, government programs. But you can see again that satellite manufacturing and the launch services are actually quite small in relationship to the business of satellite telecommunications, which is commercial satellite telecom. In 2011, again, slightly older data, but we can see here that the overall global telecommunications industry is over 4 trillion US dollars. I mean, this is a huge industry. The satellite industry, you can see, is a much smaller portion of that, something under $180 billion. That's still a lot of money. And you can see that the satellite industry is clearly the largest component of the entire space industry. Again, launch services, infrastructure, training, all of that is insurance is a tiny fraction and really exists to support the global satellite telecommunications industry. Because if we can put one of these big satellites up in geo and start operating it, that's a money machine. It's a money machine. It can generate tremendous revenue. And you can see in the slide here below that this is a continuing growth story. The satellite telecommunications revenue and spending continue to rise because they are so profitable. In 2020, we have a different landscape today. We have many more remote sensing satellites than we used to, but we also have a very large number of satellite telecommunication, telecom satellites. And most of this growth is in the new LEO mega constellations, like the one Starlink operated by Elon Musk and SpaceX. You can see in the upper right again that the United States operates by far the majority. They are the largest operator of satellites with almost half, followed by China. And you can see again in the bottom right, number of telecom satellites, the commercial satellites, 900 of the of Elon Musk with his reusable SpaceX launchers has launched over 2/3 of, or a third of all the satellites in orbit, over 2,000 satellites, a revolutionary change in the dynamic of the industry. So why do we care about this? Well, the fact is this is the business of space. Telecom is by far the largest component of the space business. And it's the only really commercially viable, the only really profitable part of the industry. It's where all the jobs are, and the launch services, the satellite construction, the ground infrastructure, all of these things really exist to support primarily the global satellite telecommunications industry. And this is the stuff that it does. And you can see over here on the left-hand side, primary domains are what we call video, voice, data, and communications, and direct to customer. Direct to customer are things like Sirius radio, satellite radio, direct broadcast television, where people have the little, the little pizza dish hanging outside their window, and they can get direct satellite television. Interactive entertainment and games is a very much a growing area of this, and things like video or data to handheld networks, voice networks, partly being involved in the satellite area. Voice, in the upper left, the blue, these are the traditional telecommunications domains of telemedicine, teleeducation, telepresence, large internet trunking, news gathering, rural telephones, video conferencing is certainly a huge new domain, certainly after COVID, business networks, government networks, broadcast, voice over internet. And again, the ground equipment, insurance, manufacturing, training, launch vehicles, all this industry exists to support primarily these telecom industries because they make so much money. And it was again, Arthur C. Clarke had the vision of the geostationary orbit and the ability to place telecommunication satellites up in this geostationary orbit so that they would hang there in the same space, in the same location as the Earth rotated. And this, his concept of this, even though earlier people did mention this, but really it was Arthur C. Clarke who conceptualized geostationary place to put telecommunication satellites, and has in large part created the global village that we live in today. And I want to pay homage to the originators of this. In 1929, Herman Oberth first proposed the concept of human occupied satellites. Uh, his idea was quite rudimentary. There would be people using mirrors like helioscopes, and they would shine the mirrors in Morse code down onto the Earth, a bit of a fanciful concept. But it was Arthur C. Clarke, the brilliant visionary in 1945 during the Second World War, at a time when many nations were still flying biplanes and piston powered airplanes. He wrote an obscure paper in a very small journal called Wireless World. And he wrote a paper called Extraterrestrial Relays. And in this, he proposed the concept that if you, and that you can see the graphic from his paper on the bottom right. He has three satellites equally spaced in geostationary orbit, and they are broadcasting the same, in this case, radio message to the entire planet. And Clarke proposed that there's this magic orbit out there. You could hang a satellite, and he basically said it's like having an incredibly tall radio tower. We could put radio transmitters up there. We would broadcast up to the transmitter and then be able to broadcast a message down, and it would cover a third of the planet. And if we put three of these satellites equally spaced around planet Earth, we could broadcast radio message to the entire planet, to every human being living on planet Earth. It was a revolutionary concept. And think about it, 1945, he said we could do this. He also envisioned in this tiny, short little paper, there is an argument for brevity. He also pointed out that you would have to have human beings because the state of technology at the time was vacuum tubes. This was well before the revolution of integrated circuits and transistors. So these were going to have to be human occupied space stations, and you would need the human crews to be able to swap out the vacuum tubes as they would burn out. We also realized that the human crews could do global weather observations. So he foresaw the geostationary arc as also being capable of providing synoptic global weather warning systems as we have today. And in my next lecture on global navigation satellite systems, I'm going to show you that in this very same brief article in 1945, Arthur C. Clarke stated that using a system like this, you could have a global positioning capability that could fit on your wrist that would be the size of a wristwatch. He envisioned all of these things that have now come to pass in the dark days of the Second World War, an extraordinary leap of intellect on. And he said in the 1960s, once telecommunications satellites had actually been developed, that a generation from now, there would be very few communities, even in the remotest part of the earth, which do not possess some kind of radio receiver or electronic blackboard or, maybe even a full television. Think about this. In my lifetime, we went from none of this to the modern era that we see today. And he said quite correctly in 1962, the communication satellite will end the ages of isolation. making us all members of a single family, teaching us to read and speak, howeverly imperfect, a single language. And that has truly come to pass. All the world is now a single electronic village. We can go anywhere on the planet today and have access global news, weather, information, television, and this was inconceivable when he came up originally with these ideas in the 1940s. Sadly, he wasn't always correct. Bottom quote says that thanks to a few tons of electronic gear, 23,000 miles above the equator, ours will be the last century of the savage, and for all mankind, the Stone Age will be over. And sadly, I wish that were true, but it seems that we are still the same hunter gatherer hunters that we have always been, even though we now have access to these amazing technologies. I wish we could find the end of the era of savagery, but we're certainly not there yet today. So it's this magical orbit just short of 36,000 kilometers above the equator. And again, very important that this must be at an orbital inclination of 0. So the geostationary orbit must be at this magical altitude, but also at an orbital inclination of 0. Otherwise, the satellite will move up and down in a figure 8. But this provides the world with this natural broadcast ability, and it has revolutionized our world. Mobile telecommunications to ships at sea to aircraft anywhere on the planet are now a routine capability. And it's a very easily scalable system. We can send up signals to a satellite in geo and literally broadcast that down to almost a third the surface of the planet. It's very scalable and it's very economical, particularly in areas of remote settlements, in areas, as I mentioned before, in Australia, throughout the Pacific Islands. It's simply not practical to lay fiber optic cables throughout the entire uh, region of the Pacific Islands. Whereas with a single satellite, we can broadcast television, radio, data, internet to a broad area. So it's very scalable. It allows us to bypass rugged terrain, mountains, oceans, rivers. They don't matter. We don't have to lay infrastructure. And again, when we have issues like earthquakes or tsunamis, things that sadly continue to plague our planet, this takes out terrestrial telecommunication systems, cell towers, radio towers. It does not affect our ability to communicate with these areas using satellite technologies. And it's just basically a very, very big commercial business. It's a fascinating history. I don't have time really to go into the history of telecommunications, but as soon as Sputnik launched, you remember Sputnik was launched by the Russians in October of 1957, and they were very smart in that they had Sputnik beep. And Sputnik beeped at a radio frequency that could be tuned in and listened to by anyone around the planet who had an amateur radio system. And so the whole world could hear Sputnik beeping. And if you look at the speed with which satellite telecommunications developed, it's really quite extraordinary. Sputnik first went up in October of 1957. A year, less than a year later, in August of 58, Explorer 6 broadcast the very first pictures from space. It was in December of 1958, literally just a year and a month after Sputnik, the United States President Dwight Eisenhower delivered the first radio broadcast, a Christmas welcome message via satellite to the entire world. A year after Sputnik, the President of the United States was broadcasting a greetings message by satellite. He tried several different technologies. Excuse me. Here at the bottom center, you see the Echo, the passive aluminum foil balloon that was launched as a passive relay. So it was a simple passive relay system where you shot a radio signal at it and it just bounced off. Worked, but didn't have a whole lot of capability. In July of 62, the first commercial communications broadcast was broadcast across the Atlantic Ocean. ComSat was created in August of 62. And I actually remember as a child in August of 1964, a geostationary satellite, SYNCOM 3, broadcast very grainy black and white images of the Tokyo Olympic Games around the world. And it was astounding. Here we were in the United States, and we were watching live the Olympics going on in Tokyo. Intelsat Corporation was created in 64, and in 1967, there was the first global television show. Of course, Beatles played and many others, but look at how quickly the technology advanced from the simple Sputnik to the kinds of telecommunications satellites we're now quite familiar with. So a very accelerated process of technology development because it was so very practical. And so here we have the Clarke orbit, the geostationary ring, as of 2018. And I'm sorry I couldn't find a more recent one. I know there are some of them out there, I couldn't get one. But here, what we're looking at are all the satellites that are out in geostationary orbit. And you can see how many they are. And this is a very packed area. Again, because these are so useful and generate so much money. You can also see here, there are stacks of these, and these are over places where you have the most need for this bandwidth. So over the west coast of the North America, over the east coast of North America, over Western Europe, over Eastern Asia, you see we have many of these satellites placed in essentially the same orbits. And this is where the ITU and the frequency allocation, orbital slot allocation in GEO is a huge geopolitical area of contest because nations want to put geostationary satellites in up orbit because they are generators of massive amounts of profit. So the geostationary arc, the Clarke orbital arc, is incredibly valuable, very crowded, and to find ways to get an orbital allocation so they can put another satellite up there. So GEO is the most expensive real estate in space. And we have, this is as of 2020, so it's changed a little bit, but not that much. We have over 1,200 objects that we track in GEO. Only about 390 of these are under control. Many of these, almost 600, are in what we call a drift orbit. They're no longer actually in a geostationary orbit. They're in a geosynchronous orbit. and they're wandering around a bit north and south. Some of them have actually been captured by Jim Green's calibration point. About 11 these are uncontrollable. We don't know. We've lost the ability to pass them. And about 66 of them are not in the public satellite catalog, and we don't actually know what those things are doing. So this is the coverage of a single geostationary satellite. So if we hang a satellite here over the equator, just off Central and Western Africa, you can see the maximum theoretical coverage, which reaches all the way down to Antarctica. But the area where we can actually service with imaging and telecommunications is somewhat smaller. You can see the smallest area is the Meteosat image, where we can actually use these data in a quantitative sense for image processing and analysis. The telecom region of a satellite covers an extremely large area. But even though Arthur Clarke conceived of these as a simple broadcast, that it would simply be broadcasting out a single message, has been superseded by much, much more complex systems. And so today, we have geostationary satellites that do what we call spot beams. And these spot beams allow the satellite to broadcast to very small local areas. And this allows them to reuse their frequency reuse, and it allows them to be much more effective to broadcast many different streams of data to individual local areas. And there's a wonderful satellite. I would urge you to go on and look, satbeams.com/footprints. And what this does, this is a website, freely accessible. You can go on here and it will show you the 400 working geostationary satellites. You can click on any one of those and it will show you the various spot beams that that particular satellite is using. So here we're looking at one specific satellite. You can see in the middle here all the individual spot beams, and then down at the bottom there's a map of one spot beam that covers a large part of the Arabian Peninsula and Turkey, and even reaching into the edges of the European continent. So don't think that these satellites just are broadcasting one message or one television channel. They actually are extremely complex, sophisticated devices that reuse their frequencies and have hundreds or dozens of spot beams that allow them to broadcast different messages, different data streams to specific locations on the planet. And I would urge you to go out and take a look at this satbeams.com/footprints website and take a look at some of the specific spot beams that are being used by the over 400 geostationary satellites in use right now as I'm speaking. So GEO has tremendous benefits. It covers about a third of the globe. We have three basic kinds of services, three basic technologies, three basic commercial markets. First is what we call fixed satellite services, FSS. And this is where we have a large dish on the ground and it receives and transmits satellite signals up to one or more geostationary satellites. And these support the majority of domestic and international telephone data, relay, all the international internet connectivity to private business networks, national governments, militaries. These have large fixed satellite dishes on the ground, communicate with one or more satellites in GEO. These are the big trunk lines that provide the backbone of commercial, business, national, and military connectivity around the planet. The second general market in GEO is what we call mobile satellite services, or MSS. And this is what allows us to put these very small dishes under a dome on things like ships at sea, trucks, aircraft, all the commercial aircraft today, every commercial ship at sea, many land vehicles have a mobile satellite capability, and it allows, and it's mobile. Literally, it's the obvious difference between fixed. Fixed is located in one place. Mobile gives you the ability of ships at sea to move around the world's oceans, but to maintain communications, data, services between that ship and the rest of the world. Third class, by far the biggest business, is called broadcast satellite services. And this is where we have a very high transmitted power from a GEO satellite that broadcasts directly to home. And so in many, many parts of the earth, you see this picture down at the bottom right, we have what we call pizza dish satellite receivers, these little things about a meter across. You can buy them and you hang it out of your window, you point it at the equator, and you can receive either direct to consumer television, radio, as well as broadband internet capabilities. So these are the three primary types of service. They're the three primary commercial markets. They're quite different. They operate in different frequencies. Now, I won't go in too much to all the frequencies, but these are all in the radio range, and they use a combination of C, Ka, and Ku bands for most of what we do. But these are the three generic types of geostationary telecommunication business services that are operated today. But there are disadvantages to GEO as well. Even though it has many advantages, it has significant disadvantages. The first one is there's a delay. Going up to GEO, processing it, and sending that message back down to the ground takes about roughly a half a second. And so in the old days, you made an international telephone call, you sometimes got a line that you had this delay. And for many applications, it doesn't matter. But for modern commuters, modern things like gaming and internet activities, where real-time connectivity is important, this GEO delay is a significant problem. We also, just because the GEO arc is limited, the frequencies are limited, we have limited bandwidth and limited orbital slots. And so we can't fulfill all the interests and needs that we would like to serve. There are issues with noise. We do have error rates. We do have a asymmetry between the uplink and the downlink. And sadly, in today's contentious world, we have a significant amount of jamming that goes on. And I'm not talking about musical type jamming. I'm not talking about reggae jams. I'm talking about intentional national governments blocking signals. And we have a significant amount of this that goes on in the world today. We have a significant amount of this going on right now in the Middle East, as well as in Ukraine. Nations are jamming the geostationary broadcast because, again, the dual use nature of these technologies. So there are disadvantages to geo. But what's another disadvantage? Can somebody tell me perhaps another disadvantage of using geostationary satellites for telecommunication? Oops, this is a serious disadvantage. A modern geostationary telecommunication $100 million. You're putting all of that on top of an enormously powerful bomb that we call a rocket. And sometimes that rocket behaves and puts that satellite right exactly where you want it. Sometimes the rocket goes boom. And so every time we launch geostationary telecommunications satellite, some government or some private corporation is putting 250 or 300 million dollars of their money on top of a bomb and hoping that everything works okay. Sometimes this is what the launch industry has an insurance program. Launch insurance is very expensive, but it's events like this that make you happy you had launch insurance if something goes wrong. But we also do have this issue of jamming, of data interception. And sadly, the European Telecommunications Satellite Corporation has reported a 4 times increase in geostationary jamming in the Middle East over just the past 5 years. So there are significant advantages to geostationary telecom, but there are also significant disadvantages. So let's look at what do these things look at? What do they look like? This is a current generation Boeing direct television satellite. These things are huge. They are massive. Here's the satellite on the right in its fully extended configuration, in its orbital configuration. You can see it's got lots of dishes because it's sending many different spot beams down to different markets on the planet. It has tremendously large solar arrays because it takes a lot of power. This is a direct broadcast satellite. It's broadcasting television to people's little pizza dish receivers. So you have to have a lot of power to broadcast so that you can receive a clear image on one of these tiny small dishes that you hang outside your window. So these have huge solar arrays because they require tremendous amounts of power to burst that amount of electromagnetic radiation down to the ground. On the left, here is the satellite in its stowed launch configuration. This is a 6,000 kilo vehicle at launch. That's 3 tons of satellite. You can see it's all folded up to fit inside the payload fairing of a commercial launch vehicle, and then it unfolds itself. And you can see here in the center, here is the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, and this Boeing satellite, once it's in its orbital configuration, is taller than the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. So these are huge, expensive, very complex machines. And what did they do? They deliver 520 channels of absolute garbage to your telephone, home shopping network, Beavis and Butthead in 32 languages. And yeah, this is what we're using all of this extraordinarily advanced and expensive technology is to beam all this stuff down to our homes. And, hey, what can I say? It's a commercial business and people buy this stuff. But it really plays a much more vital and important role in our world. Satellite telecommunications provide global, uncensored news content around the world, and they make possible teleeducation, telemedicine, telepresence, telereach, teleworking throughout the planet in remote places of our world, places like India, places like the Pacific Islands. That satellite telecommunication reaches out across our planet, and it provides vital services, and it's only going to get more so in the future. Now, there is a long and very important history of this in the Middle East. Arabsat was launched in 1985 on the space shuttle. And my very good friend and colleague, Ali Al-Mashat, who was at that time the president of Arabsat, was the person who was instrumental in the launch of Arabsat 1A. And he was also instrumental in the fact that Prince Sultan bin Salman Al Saud was able to fly as a member of the Space Shuttle Mission 51G crew. And you can see the crew here, and there's the Prince in the upper right getting ready for his launch. And at the lower right, you can see this satellite being ejected from its payload container here in the shuttle bay. You can see it's rising up above the tail and going up into its orbit. You can see down here a very large rocket engine at the bottom of it, which is used to raise its orbit from the shuttle's orbit of maybe 300, 350 kilometers to that magical geostationary orbit high up in space. So there is a long history of geostationary telecommunications satellites. And again, it is my very dear friend and long-term colleague, Lee Al-Mashat, who was instrumental in managing and growing Arabsat and the launch of this very first geostationary telecommunications satellite in the Arab world. And this has continued today. Here's a current generation. This is Saudi Geosat 1. This is built by Lockheed Martin, launched just a couple of years ago in 2019 on board an 5 satellite. This is the 16th satellite launched, and it's again about 3 metric tons in a geostationary orbit. And again, you can see here it is in its launch configuration. You see it's all folded up together. And then over here on the left, you see it in its final orbital configuration. And these satellites provide much of the telecommunications capability throughout the Middle East today. They all require ground infrastructure. Here we have a ground station in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia. You can see this is what we call a teleport. You can see it's a very large facility. It has 2 quite large dishes. These are for the trunk capabilities, very high precision capabilities, very large dishes, as well as you can see it has a series of smaller dishes as well. So all of this, satellite is only one part of, we have the satellites, but all of this telecommunications requires a ground infrastructure as well, and jobs and people down here working as we speak right now. So we're undergoing a new revolution in satellite telecommunications. This is largely driven again by Elon Musk and his Starlink constellation. And what we're seeing is not a movement entirely from GEO to LEO, but an addition of satellite telecommunications down into these very dense LEO constellations. And the benefit, of course, is low latency. What this does is you don't have the latency. It's so close that it's certainly nearly instantaneous. And also, it's so close to the ground that you can use a tiny little dish like the one shown in the slide at the bottom center. And so there's many benefits to the LEO. The negative is that you need a huge number of satellites, because the lower you go, the smaller the footprint the satellite has on the ground, and therefore you need thousands of satellites. So Elon Musk's Starlink constellation, the first installation of this, has 72 orbital planes with 22 satellites in each. It's almost 1,600 satellites initially. Today, there are over 2,300 of these satellites in one constellation, providing now near global high bandwidth satellite telecommunications. And he's not the only one. OneWeb is going to launch a constellation of over 650. Kuiper, Jeff Bezos wants to launch another constellation of over 3,000. Chinese and others are also involved. There's lots of issues in policy and legal and international issues involved in the development of these incredibly dense LEO constellations. The astronomers are very upset because they can see these things. The sun shines on them, and they're messing up their ability to do observational astronomy. And of course, it also increases hugely the potential for collisions. And so we're seeing a huge revolution in satellite telecommunications today. The development and population of these LEO constellations, they have many benefits: low latency, high bandwidth, nearly global coverage. There are also some significant issues that we are going to have to face. Isn't that all fascinating? So I have, again, a very brief video that I would like to queue up. Again, I want to have us go to the Satellite Explorer website, and please feel free to visit this on your own time and take a look. It's free, it's publicly accessible, it's frequently updated. It's a really useful tool for us to be able to analyze and study all the satellites that we have in Earth today.
Hey, everybody, it's me again, and I want to talk to you now about communication satellites. Satellites have revolutionized our ability to communicate across the entire globe. And I want to go back to our Satellite Explorer website, and I hope you've taken a chance to go here and look at this. It's a wonderful free resource. I'm going to click down here again on purpose, and I'm going to click on communications. And you can see that almost 70% of all satellites that we have up and operating today are used in telecommunications, both civilian and government operated systems. And you can see, again, we have this huge number of satellites. This is where all of these geostationary communication satellites operate. And you can see we can just click on them. Here's a Chinese satellite. Here's an American NASA tracking and data relay system. Here's an Intelsat satellite. These things all live out at this magic geostationary orbit. Then we also have, again, some highly elliptical orbit satellites. And again, these are used by Russia because the Russian mainland is so far north that geostationary satellites over the equator are sometimes difficult to reach. So they use these for communication as well. But the new revolution is all of these amazingly dense low Earth orbit constellations that we have. And this is a huge change in the telecom world. It all used to be out in GEO. Here's Starlink, our Elon Musk's Starlink system. You can see they're all in, for a couple of them, in a standard orbit that covers almost all of the occupied parts of the planet. And you can see that this constellation is very dense, and these satellites are constantly crossing and crisscrossing across. Here, I'll pick one, and it gives you, of course, the information about it. And if we go to it, it gives us, again, its orbital parameters. And here you can see where the satellite is actually passing over right now as we are doing this recording. So these satellite constellations are a huge new change in how we're doing telecom. It all used to be out in GEO, and now we have these various different constellations
we have to do a good job managing the resource. And this is something that I know Chris will be talking about in his lecture
Right.
on space policy and law.
Okay, well, that was great. We're going to wrap up for tonight or today, depending on where you are. And these have been an exciting set of satellite application lectures today. Tomorrow we have more. Scott, you'll be talking about PNT, yep, and positioning, navigation, and timing. And we'll also have an opportunity to talk about space law. So once again, thanks very much, and we'll do you again tomorrow. Bye now.
Cool. Bye-bye. Thank you.
We move layers in silence, leave it all behind us. Meta visions are flying to galaxies unknown. In space we merge with science, technology with new guidance. Yeah, we travel so far away. Fly, 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 we fly through the sky. New frontiers can open our minds. No, we're not so far from our dream. Energy brings us life. Running at the midnight, white lights, supernova, until the twilight, the bright skies, supernova, up to the moon, we will go beyond our reason.